scale of Soviet deliveries to Germany and the timing of those deliveries, there's nothing really that can be pointed to that has an immediate effect in 1940. You can certainly make the case, as I do and I did earlier on, that the conflict between the two in 1941 is almost unthinkable without those mutual supplies. Bizarrely, they're arming each other. So those supplies come into play in 1941. So it kicks in much later on. So there's no evidence really that it's decisive in any way in 1940, but I think it is by 1941.
The war that resulted was Poland being invaded by the German state, but not by Russia. This was the Soviet Union, and there's a big difference between the Soviet Union and Russia. Huge numbers of people, Russia was one of 15 republics, and this is even worse, I think, than talking about the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Russia, of course, was led by Joseph Stalin, who wasn't a Russian. But if you look at the manpower of the Red Army in the Second World War, this is something I learned from my Polish father-in-law, who saw the Red Army pouring into Poland beginning in 1945. I asked him what his impression was, and the answer was unlimited quantities of young men who all came from Central Asia. These weren't Russians. This was the Soviet Union on the march, and a large part of the Soviet Union was not Russian. So I think it's a draw, Andrei. You win on the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and I win on the Soviet.
I don't have Russian, unfortunately, so I didn't personally do the research in Moscow. I did have a very useful young man who did, as far as was possible, do research for me in Moscow. I had also someone in Belarus doing research as well. I have the German, and I have a number of people doing other things for me. So I had to rely on other people to do research. In the Russian case, the archival situation, as I understand it, is going backwards, in fact, from what it was in the early 1990s. But fortunately, in this respect, quite a lot of material has been published in the meantime. So when the archives were briefly open, some important documents were seen and copied and translated, so they are available in translation, notably in Polish, of course. So there is some archival basis for the Soviet position, and that's some of the material that I quote. I mean, the various conversations between Molotov and others, and Stalin and others, through which you can put together, I think, you can put together the Soviet mindset in 1939. The archival situation is difficult, I appreciate, but that's what we're faced with. It might be that in another 10, 15 years, if everything changes and the archives are open, that someone can go in and make a proper sort of archival job of recreating that mindset. But at the moment, and in my experience, we are basically feeding on scraps, unfortunately. But I think, from what I've seen and what I've used, I think I've sort of recreated it in a way that convinces me. So I'm quite happy with that for the moment. But then again, in 10, 15 years' time, I'd be happy to be corrected again. But that's where we are. And again, I didn't want it to be purely archival. I think that's quite an important point as well. I wanted it to be a human history. So what I liked to use was eyewitness accounts and diaries, stuff like Dimitrov's diary, which is fantastic, where he notes down conversations with Stalin in 1939 and what Stalin's thinking, what Stalin's saying. And I think that is as good in trying to recreate that mindset as anything else.
When you say the Eastern Front, there are actually 3 Eastern Fronts. The Russian Empire was fighting not only against the Central Powers in Europe who was fighting against the Ottomans. And then, of course, in the Caucasus, I went to Baku last year for the first time and found that there was a British cemetery in Baku. Now, who remembers that? And in fact, if you look at the strategy of the war, the Russian operations against the Ottomans, aiming, of course, to take over Constantinople and the Straits, was probably as menacing a front as any of the others. So the more we can do to open people's horizons, the better. Let me just tell you one story from Krakow about 1914, the summer of 1914, and it concerns the end of the academic year, the Rok Akademicki, at the Jagiellonian University in July 1914. The students were milling around in front of the Collegium Novum. You know, there was the ceremony at the end of the year, and they were all going home. Those Polish students were nearly all reserve officers, as was the habit in those days. Some of them went home to the Russian Empire. Some of them went home to the German Empire, and some of them stayed in the Austrian Empire. And within 3 weeks, those young men were actually firing at each other. And that was Poland's loss in the First World War. Famous poem written about it. Now, British people, I think, are simply not aware of these stories. But they're not little sideshows. This is right in the heart of the war.
We do have, already there are a few foreign editions already signed. It's going into Danish, it's going to Polish, it's being translated already into Polish. And just this last week, I've agreed Estonian and Romanian. So it is getting a lot of interest in the region that the book deals with, which is very satisfying. And I hope it will go into Belarusian and Ukrainian and all of the Baltic languages. That would be terrific. It is very interesting what you say that this has an immediate resonance now. What's happening in the last sort of 6 months or a year in that region. It's very interesting. A couple of weeks ago, there was a piece that appeared, I think, on the Telegraph website about a mass grave that was discovered in western Ukraine, so former Kherson, which the Ukrainians had publicised and had said this is an NKVD massacre site of Poles. Apparently, they were Polish policemen. Something like 900 bodies in the mass grave. And I found it very interesting, and I thought that given the climate that we have now, where Ukraine, at least Kiev, is essentially looking for sticks with which to beat the Kremlin, I think there might be more of these coming out of the woodwork, because, as you'll see from the book, this was not an isolated example. I mean, many towns and cities in that region had their own mini Katyns, had massacres, especially at the very end when the Germans were on the horizon in June and July, or early July 1941. The NKVD tended to do away with those that they didn't want to survive the day. So these were not isolated examples, and I suspect that those sites have probably lived on in public memory, never been talked about openly, but everyone knows that there's that little hollow down the way, and that's where 40 or 50 or 100 or 200 bodies are. And I suspect now, with the current climate, this might be the next sort of trend that we see, because that gives Kiev a stick with which to beat Mr. Putin. So it's very interesting. I mean, there are wider parallels which, over the last 6 months or so, I've actually found rather spooky. Not least in the sort of rhetoric that comes out of the Kremlin, which seems very, very similar and sort of resonates with what Stalin was saying in excusing his actions between 1939 and 1941. So there's a lot of rather spooky parallels, but it's very interesting how things have shifted in this last 6 months. And it seems to me, I mean, I would say this anyway, wouldn't I? But it seems to me that the book is actually all the more important now than it was 6 months ago, because it seems to have that resonance.
I have a practical suggestion. The Ukrainian economy is in a very bad state. I doubt whether Ukrainian publishers can afford to buy the rights from Roger and his publishers. So why doesn't somebody here who has connections with a foundation in Poland get the Poles to pay for Roger's book to be translated into Ukraine?
There are various thoughts in Stalin's head, but it's interesting that the one that he later gives as the motivation, which is I was defensive one. I was holding Hitler off. I knew Hitler was going to attack me. Therefore, I made this pact, bought myself time. This is something that he says first on the 3rd of July 1941. There's no, as far as I've seen, there's no evidence of that motivation being given in 1939. That's post facto justification for the pact. What you do see in 39 is what I mentioned to you, which is that he's sort of using Hitler to go west, attacking the imperialists, and in a sense using Hitler as the battering ram. And there's a lovely quote from Molotov in conversation with a Lithuanian communist in 1940, who foresees this sort of the vistas of possibility, which are that at some point in the future the Red Army is going to move west unopposed, and it will win a climactic battle somewhere on the Rhine, according to Molotov, against not the Nazis, because the Nazis will have been destroyed, but against the remnants of European bourgeoisie. This is Molotov's sort of vision of the future in 1940, which is I think quite telling. That's what they're talking about when they get drunk in the Kremlin late at night in the little corner. That's the vision that is sort of that they're comforting themselves with. The question of British policy. Britain is the traditional Soviet interpretation was always that the British had colluded with the Germans at Munich the year before, that they were, in a sense, trying to turn, making deals with Hitler, secret deals with Hitler. They wanted to turn him east. I don't see any real evidence of that at all. What the British are trying to do in 1939 in their diplomacy is essentially preserve the status quo. They're not trying to turn Hitler eastwards. They're not trying to provoke war between Stalin and Hitler. They're trying to preserve a precarious status quo. And the bottom line with the pact is that Hitler could offer Stalin a much better deal than the West could, Britain, because he could offer a lot of territory, all of Russia's irredenta from the First World War, perceived irredenta, essentially for inaction, for not doing anything. Whereas the British and the French wanted the Soviets to come in on their side to try and hem in Germany. So he had to do nothing, and he could gain enormous amounts of territory. So essentially, Hitler had a better hand to make a deal with Stalin than the West did. But I don't see the West turning Hitler eastwards at all.
The argument that Stalin produced afterwards, that his policy in 39, 40, 41 had been defensive, there's no sign of it at all in 1939. Stalin had several clear objectives. One, we have a Polish audience. In 1938, a year ago, Stalin had shot the entire leadership of the Polish Communist Army. Everybody talks about catching. Very few people reflect on this other terrible bloodletting. But it wasn't just a massacre. It was the key thing is that Stalin did not replace the Polish Communist Party that he had abolished. This meant that he had no intentions of preparing a Polish communist movement to run Poland. He had no intention of, he had no future in which a Polish state existed already before the war. And Stalin actually only recreated a Polish Communist Party in 1943, i.e. 5 years later, when the situation was completely different. So in 1939, it's pretty obvious that Stalin was hoping to benefit by the destruction of Poland. We do have one document. I've not checked whether it's in Roger's book. It's a bit controversial, but the notes of the Politburo meeting of the 19th of August 1939, this is immediately before the German-Soviet Pact, were leaked by a French communist, and they were produced in Paris. Now, some people say these were fabrications and so on. But they do give a clear indication that Stalin thought this was an excellent opportunity. He realized that he was setting the dogs of war unleashed. He didn't know where it was leading to, but he could see that it was too good a chance to miss, and that was, I think, his planning. The other thing is, nobody knew in 1939 what the outcome would be of the German attack on the Western powers. We know that it was very quick, that Germany overran France in 6 weeks. Nobody imagined that possible. On the contrary, the general belief was that Germany would become bogged down in a war on the Western Front, like the First World War, which would go on for years. And Germany's involvement on the Western Front would give Stalin all sorts of opportunities in the East. Stalin's bad luck was that Hitler finished off the Western powers in double quick time and then decided to attack the Soviet Union. But it could have been completely different. Everything that Stalin and the Soviet narrative says afterwards about them preparing to defend the Soviet Union smacks of Stalin laundry project.
That discussion between Molotov and the Lithuanian communist, whose name is utterly unpronounced, I'm afraid. But he recorded it. He actually subsequently resigned. He was a communist, or communist leaving, and was foreign minister, so appointed foreign minister as the Soviets thought in that process of taking over. When he then subsequently went to Moscow and had these conversations with Molotov, he was so horrified that he not only wrote them down, he then probably resigned. Because he realised that as an idealistic left-wing and idealistic communist, he realised that the Soviets were bent on pushing westwards. And that phrase that is used, in Molotov's discussion, where he says, we're going to, there'll be this climactic battle on Pride. That to me was one of those sort of moments where it sort of all began to fall into place. That this was not really an ulterior motive, but actually was one of the main motives behind the Pact for Stalin. So I found that particularly sort of revelatory. the same subject, just to come back to what Norman said about this disputed version of the disputed account of the Politburo meeting on 19th of August. Yes, it is disputed, and I do mention it in the book. It's the subject of lots of controversy whether this is a true account or not. But the point is, and I make this point again in the book, the point is that you can find Stalin saying, and others, Molotov included, saying pretty similar things in bona fide accounts elsewhere. So actually it does ring rather true, even if that particular account is disputed. And yeah, hopefully we can sort of address the mythology rather quicker than we've been able to in terms of medieval witchcraft. Hopefully that will work. The second question here about the reasons why this has been so slow to be revised, should we say? Let's put it in a more benign way. Why this has been so slow to be revised? The first point I think is quite a simple one. It's complicated. This is a massive sort of complication of our general understanding of World War II. We're not talking here about academics. Again, we're talking about the general public's understanding, as I made clear in my presentation. Academics, I think, know this stuff generally, but it doesn't necessarily percolate down to the ordinary history reader. And this is complicated. We have this image of the Grand Alliance, everyone pulling together, unlikely alliance of the Western powers, the democracies, with Stalin, uniting to defeat fascism. That's quite a nice, neat message to sell. Real life, as I think my book demonstrates, is actually much more complicated. So that's one reason, is it's fundamentally complicated. People like simple messages. The second point is that it was fundamentally embarrassing. Of course, it's embarrassing for the communists. The Soviet Union, they were, spent the last 50 years of their existence denying that the secret protocol existed until they were forced to in 1990. And the whole subject was taboo in the Soviet bloc. We didn't talk about the Nazi-Soviet Pact as Norman described. So it was profoundly embarrassing to the Soviet bloc and to the Soviet Union. It was also embarrassing for the West, because no one had seen this coming. This was an absolute game changer in 1939. It had turned all of our ideological assumptions on their heads. So no one had seen this coming. So it's embarrassing for the West as well. There's another reason why it wasn't something that was generally spoken about. There is, I think, also, to some extent, I don't like to overplay the sort of ideological aspect, but there is an ideological aspect here where academics tend to be, shall we say, of a liberal left persuasion, and throughout that period, up until 1989, there was a general, as Norman has described, a general disinclination to talk about this stuff, and certainly to talk about it with perhaps the degree of honesty that they needed to. So there are various factors that feed into the fact that this wasn't talked about openly in the way that it should have been, certainly until really 1989 and onwards.
The phrase morally inconvenient. This is extremely good summary of what we've been talking about. Yes, the Nazi-Soviet Pact was and is morally inconvenient. It in fact deconstructs the whole popular narrative of how we won the war, what the Second World War was all about. I caught the phrase, what should we pass on, presumably to the younger generation, and it's connected. My answer would be connected to this question of moral judgment in history. What is morally convenient? And the answer is to suspect one's own side, suspect the narratives that we're told. Did we win the war? Who won the war? Unfortunately, in Europe, Stalin won the war. And this wasn't a victory for liberation or freedom or democracy, quite the opposite. It was a victory which enabled Stalin to enslave half of Europe for the next 50 years. And what should be passed on, I'm sure, 5-year-old children would have understood this. Suspect people who boast Did we win the war? No, we didn't. We were dead lucky to be on the winning side, which is rather different. And I think Vander's son can understand that, like anybody else. Let me just close the proceedings. Totally irrelevant answer, but Roger mentioned a Latvian communist with an unpronounceable Lithuanian words, yes, a name that's unpronounceable. I remember an evening with Leszek Caucasus, who, as you know, had written the definitive deconstruction of Marxism. And he told us that Marx's grandfather had changed his name. His original family name was Katzenellenbogen. And the remark was, can you imagine if instead of Marxism we had to study Katzenellenbogen? Thank you very much.